Right, we're picking up again from the book of Job, and tonight we're in chapter 24. And we've got 25 verses, and I'll just read over it quickly, and then we'll get into the subject of tonight. So, Job chapter 24. Why, seeing times are not hidden from the Almighty, do they that know him not see his days? Some remove the landmarks, they violently take away flocks and feed thereof. They drive away the ass of the fatherless, they take the widow's ox for a pledge. They turn the needy out of the way, the poor of the earth hide themselves together. Behold, as wild asses in the desert go they forth to their work, rising betimes for a prey. The wilderness yieldeth food for them and for their children. They reap every one his corn in the field, and they gather the vintage of the wicked. They cause the naked to lodge without clothing, that they have no covering in the cold. They are wet with the showers of the mountains, and embrace the rock for want of a shelter. They pluck the fatherless from the breast, and take a pledge of the poor. They cause him to go naked without clothing, and they take away the sheaf from the hungry, which make oil within their walls, and tread their winepresses, and suffer thirst. Men groan from out of the city, and the soul of the wounded crieth out, yet God layeth not folly to them. They are of those that rebel against the light. They know not the ways thereof, nor abide in the paths thereof. The murderer rising with the light killeth the poor and needy, and in the night is as a thief. The eye also of the adulterer waiteth for the twilight, saying, No face shall see me, and disguiseth his face. In the dark they dig through the houses, which they had marked for themselves in the daytime. They know not the light. For the morning is to them even as the shadow of death. If one know them, they are in the terrors of the shadow of death. He is swift as the waters, their portion is cursed in the earth. He beholdeth not the way of the vineyards. Drought and heat consume the snow waters, so doth the grave those which have sinned. The womb shall forget him, the worm shall feed sweetly on him. He shall be no more remembered, and wickedness shall be broken as a tree. He evil entreateth the barren that beareth not, and doeth not good to the widow. He draweth also the mighty with his power, he riseth up, and no man is sure of his life. Though it be given him to be in safety, whereon he resteth, yet his eyes are upon their ways. They are exalted for a little while, but are gone and brought low. They are taken out of the way as all other, and cut off as the tops of the ears of corn. And if it be not so now, who will make me a liar and make my speech nothing worth? So tonight in Job chapter 24, we pick up with Job changing the subject. In this chapter, Job, he for a time ceases to make complaints to God in the bitterness of his soul, as we've heard before, but now instead he begins to deal with a very different topic. So, as we've heard many times before now in the studies on Job, Job has gone through unimaginable sorrow, tragedy, and loss. You know, think about bereavement and horrible times you've had to go through, if you've had to go through them. Some of you might not have had to deal with death and suffering and sorrow yet. But Job is going through pretty much the maximum amount of pain a man can go through with the death of his children, with the loss of all things, his health, everything is gone. And Job, in the previous chapters, he has made several bitter complaints to God about the perceived injustices he has received at the hand of the Lord. And you understand that as you read through the book of Job. He's a very righteous man. We know the Lord has personally called him righteous in chapter 1. And yet, from Job's perspective, he believes he's being punished for crimes that he, from his perspective, has not committed. Job has complained about being punished when he has lived a righteous life, and so far we have not read anything in the book of Job that would tell us that he was getting what he deserved with what has happened to him. Job, you see, by chapter 24, Job is upset with God, and in chapter 23, he complains that God did not take him home before all of this bad stuff happened to him. And instead of being absent from the body and present with the Lord, instead Job is being forced to live through all of this suffering. Job's time has not yet come up. And Job wishes in chapter 23 that God would have killed him sooner before he had to live through these black and bleak days of hardship and sorrow, days that he cannot see through. And now Job changes the subject and he begins to argue with his three friends once again. And the subject matter that is being dealt with in Job chapter 24 is the wicked in the earth. And today we live in a world that is full of wickedness, corrupt people, corrupt politicians, all these people who are prospering and doing well in the world. A lot of them are very wicked indeed. And Job's three friends have so far, their point to Job repeatedly has been that God punishes the wicked in the earth. And as such, because God punishes the wicked in the earth, Job must have been really bad for God to either indirectly allow or directly cause all of this bad stuff to happen to him so far. And Job in chapter 24 is refuting this point of view. He is challenging it, he is opposing it. And he tells his three friends that the very opposite of this observation of life is true. You see, Job has already spoken on this topic back in chapter 21. In chapter 21, Job has made it plain that evil people do actually prosper in the world, and many find good things in the world, contrary to what his friends have been talking about. And in addition to reiterating some of the things that Job spoke about in chapter 21, chapter 24, it serves also as a further enlargement of Job chapter 12 and verse 6, where we read, and this is Job speaking, "The tabernacles of robbers prosper," that's like their houses, "and they that provoke God are secure, into whose hand God bringeth abundantly." Now, amongst many things in the book of Job, 42 chapters, two major questions, amongst many things, but two major questions are presented and two major questions stand out that are dealt with in this book. The first of which is, why do quote-unquote bad things happen to quote-unquote good people? And second is, why do quote-unquote evil people prosper and do well in life? So let's bring it right up to date here in 2026. Why do children get killed in wars like what we see with Iran and Israel, and bombed and blown up and abused like all the Epstein stuff, and corrupt, seedy, perverted men who profit from the wars? Why do they get to, in turn, grow old, rich, fat, live in amazing houses with families, cars, holidays, and the rest of it? How do you reconcile a loving God of justice and the obvious injustices that we see each and every day in every single way? A big hot topic in the UK and all of Western Europe and a lot of the world at the moment is immigration. You know, why do illegal immigrants, scammers, violent killers, muggers and rapists and thieves get to live in taxpayer-funded prisons and accommodations and hotel rooms and get fed and watered by the government, while the majority of people who are born here have to work hour after hour, day in, day out in jobs they don't like in order just to barely scrape by? Why is it set up in such a way? And the answers to these two initial questions, as we'll come to learn, are all about perspective. You know, who is truly good and who is bad? What is a good thing and what is a bad thing in our eyes and in the eyes of the Lord? Who gets to define what is good and evil? And who says that God will not one day settle accounts with those that do wickedly? Are we looking at things from our limited mortal perspective, our point of view in time, or from God's eternal perspective that we learn about from reading the Bible? You see, we judge things very differently to how God judges things. And so with that being said, we pick up from the first verse of Job chapter 24. And we read, "Why, seeing times are not hidden from the Almighty," that's the first point, "do they that know him not," secondly, "see his days," third point. So in other words, if you read that verse again, it's saying, if God knows everything, and this is Job asking a question, if God knows everything, past, present and future, why does he allow evil to carry on and prosper in the world? Why doesn't God put a stop to it straight away? Why doesn't God kill the evil people straight away? How come God doesn't stop them dead in their tracks if he knows exactly what it is they're going to do? It's an interesting question, and all throughout the Bible, since people have been committing evil, or since the fall of man, God has at times intervened and put a stop to the evil schemes of men and so on, but for the most part, they have been allowed to commit their evil deeds. And really, this kind of line of questioning, it's another form of the question asked by the atheist. The atheists, you see, they frequently ask, how can a loving God allow cancer, diseases and wars to be allowed to happen and occur in the world? How do you reconcile the two, a world of injustice and a loving God? Surely a loving God would not allow such things. That is their point of view. But the problem the atheists have is that they don't read the Bible. They reject the revelation of God. What they try and do is they try and understand God through the use of their own flawed intellect and fallen Adamic minds. We read in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 21, "For after that, in the wisdom of God, the world, by wisdom," that's like man's wisdom, man's intellect, "knew not God. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe." In other words, God is not dealing with you in your prideful intellect. He's dealing with you in your heart. That is how you get to God, through his word, and it is belief in the heart, not the head. You see, the atheists, those that reject the Bible and reject the Lord, they do not know God. They don't know him. They don't understand God's holiness, who he is and how he operates. They don't know the Lord because they won't read his word. As I've just said, you cannot come to God through your own understanding without this book, without this Bible. Proverbs chapter 3 rebukes that whole idea. Lean not upon thine own understanding. We're told not to lean upon it in that verse in Proverbs chapter 3. And Job is not as silly as the atheist. Job is not as stupid or proud as the atheist. Job knows full well there is a God in heaven, and he's asking these very difficult questions. And the question in verse 1 of Job chapter 24 is a very good question for us to think about today, as all too often we get down and depressed in this present evil world, where so many people hate God, hate the Bible, do evil, they do evil, wicked things, they say evil, wicked things, they blaspheme the Lord, they claim to represent God in churches like the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England, and yet live like total hypocrites. They promote sin all day long, and nothing seems to happen to these people, and they seem to, from our perspective in time, get away with everything and receive all this praise and honour in this life that we do not get when we're trying to live righteous lives for the Lord. And not only do people seem to get away with evil today, but the people who practice evil things today seem to be multiplying in number, and what they're doing seems to get worse and worse and more depraved as the years go on. And you see even with people at work, with people with whom you have to deal with in business each day, basic standards of decency, of manners and behaviour, they're falling off a cliff in all areas of life, and we have to put up with it and navigate this present evil world. We speak about it oftentimes. There is very little encouragement for the sound Christian today. A lot of ministries that on the face of it seem to be doing well have obvious flaws and areas of compromise that we wouldn't tolerate. The churches, the sound ones at least, are shrinking, and it seems that less and less people have an interest in the Lord, the gospel, sound doctrine, and the Lord's local churches today than ever before, for the most part. I know there are exceptions to the rule. And yet, in spite of all of this negativity and rubbish of the last days of the Laodicean church age that we have to put up with, as God, in his wisdom, he has put us here and set us up at this particular time of history for reasons that only he knows and they're not apparent to us right now in time. In these days, chapters like Job 24 can help us to get a good biblical perspective on why things are the way they are in this present evil age, and how to navigate these times of uncertainty with both faith and patience. And the first verse of Job chapter 24, as I've already alluded to, it can be broken down into three components. So we read, why seeing times are not hidden from the Almighty. Stop there. Times not hidden. So, in other words, seeing that God is omniscient, he is all-knowing. God does not learn anything, he does not increase in knowledge because he knows it all already, past, present, and future. Everything is naked and laid bare before him. You cannot lie to God. So why seeing times not hidden from the Almighty, do they that know him not? So point 2, you've got the lost, they that know him not. These are those that could know God, but they have chosen not to know him in this life, and so they are held accountable to God for their impenitency after death. They could have sought him, they could have felt after God, they had a measure of light in their lives that was given to them, and they rejected it and walked away. And as such, they're accountable to God for that choice. And we know that the lost, they live as they do because they do not know God. What they do is a consequence of what they believe. The lost commit the sins they do because they choose not to know God. And if God was in all of their thoughts, they'd live a different life, just as we all would. And point 3 of Job 24 verse 1, so we've read about God's omniscience, we've read about the lost, and now we're going to read at the end of the verse, what is it? Do they that know him not see his days? Point 3. So that would be prosperity in this life. If God's omniscient, why do the lost receive good things in this life? Why do they get to see the days that the Lord has made, in spite of all the evil they do and their rebellion against God? And this whole thing, really, it ties in quite nicely to Luke chapter 16. You know, the Lord gives the account of the rich man and Lazarus. And he, the rich man, he received good things in this life, didn't he, as we remember? But we know from our New Testament revelation, the Lord Jesus tells us that when he died, he went to hell. But then that really is similar to what Job is dealing with here. However, unlike us today in this room with our completed Bibles in front of us and our New Testaments, Job can only see the first part of that story. He can only see men like the rich men doing well in this life, all the while rejecting the Lord from his perspective in time. And again, we see a lot of people who hate God, reject the Bible, prospering whilst making no attempts to repent or seek him in any sincerity. And Job, from his point in time, is trying to work it all out. How come? Again, if God knows everything, why does God allow the lost to carry on in life and enjoy the common blessings of God? Think about that. The use of God's world. Ultimately, God made this thing, and God tolerates these wicked people using his world. He gives them the benefits of his seasons, the rain and the sunshine, the health of their bodies, and the ability to enjoy a fruitful marriage and produce children and have a family. Why are all these blessings granted to wicked, atheistic, hateful people who have no time for God at all? Why does God permit this, and why does God permit the innocent to suffer and perish? These are interesting questions, and again, think about this one, who truly is innocent? And Job's subsequent comments, so the things he's going to say after verse 1, they can be broken down into 3 groups. You've got verses 2 to 12, and we'll talk about the remaining parts after this, but let's just deal with the first chunk of verses from verses 2 to 12. So Job, he starts to prove his point about the wicked actually prospering in the earth, totally opposite to what his 3 friends have been telling him about. You see, the wicked, they do not necessarily get punished in the earth, but oftentimes they do well. And Job begins his point, he's proving his point, by drawing attention to the conditions of those who attack and exploit the poor. That's his first group of people he's using to prove his point. Those that attack and exploit the poor. Oftentimes these types seem to get away with what they do, and we're going to read some verses. Verse 2, some remove the landmarks, that's like theft, damage, vandalism. They violently take away flocks and feed thereof, confiscation of property and theft. Verse 3, they drive away the ass of the fatherless, the vulnerable. They take the widow's ox, those whose husbands died, for a pledge. Again, confiscation of property, extortion and exploitation of the vulnerable. Verse 4, they turn the needy, the poor, the weak, out of the way. The poor of the earth hide themselves together. Again, it's like bullying behaviour, isn't it? The strong attacking the weak. Eviction from property and lands. Again, the abuse and exploitation of the vulnerable. Verse 5, behold, as wild asses in the desert go they forth to their work, rising betimes for a prey. The wilderness yieldeth food for them, and for their children, the wicked, they prosper. They reap every one his corn in the field, and they gather the vintage of the wicked. They seem to do well. Verse 7, they cause the naked to lodge without clothing. They actually cause people to live like that because of the deeds they do, that they have no covering in the cold. Again, these people who exploit the poor, They're not paying these people enough to cover their basic needs. They're making decisions that have massive negative ramifications for many people. And again, we think about the thing of theft. Verse 8, they, the poor, they are wet with the showers of the mountains. They're without shelter and clothing, and embrace the rock for want of a shelter. It's like homelessness, neglect. Verse 9, they pluck the fatherless from the breast and take a pledge of the poor. Again, extortion and exploitation. Verse 10, they cause him to go naked without clothing. They're causing poverty. And they take away the sheaf from the hungry, starvation. Verse 11, this talks about the poor, how they're actually labouring within the dwellings of the rich, and yet they want, which make oil within their walls, the rich, they're working for them, and tread their wine presses, they're labouring for them, and suffer thirst. The rich have all this abundance, and yet these poor people who work in the rich men's land and their factories and farms, they suffer want. The poor serve the rich, and yet in spite of the rich's abundance, the poor workers still lack the things that are needful. It's like capitalism, isn't it? And it sounds a lot like the way the world is run today with its cartel capitalism, the big, powerful business groups, the 1%ers, the super rich, and you've got everybody else who are just scraping by each month, just bellyache making ends meet. Why does God tolerate this setup to carry on? Verse 12, men groan from out of the city, and the soul of the wounded crieth out. So God can hear the cries of the suffering and the prayers of those that are cast down. Yet, end of verse 12, this is what Job says, yet God layeth not folly to them. They're not in trouble with God, so it seems. So Job's point here, within this first bunch of verses, is that God allows wicked people to exploit the poor and take advantage of them. And in verse 12 we've read that God layeth not folly to them. So, from Job's perspective, the wicked get away with it. God does not stop this whole situation from happening. It happened in Job's day, and it happens today in our present world. So why does Job draw attention to the poor in chapter 24? Why this particular group of people? And oftentimes, why does the Bible speak in detail about how rulers are to treat and deal with the poor? And why does the Bible speak in detail about how God expects his saints to treat the poor in the church and in their dealings with poor people in the world? Why does God give instruction on that? Well, Job, he draws special attention to the poor because the poor are vulnerable. They oftentimes find themselves at the mercy of the rich and powerful. And this situation is so for many reasons. The poor are vulnerable because the poor have to borrow money for everything. They are at the mercy of creditors who can exploit them. They can be charged extortionate interest rates and be exploited by usurers in their desperation. If payments are not kept up with, things can be seized and taken from them by enforcement agents and bailiffs. It's like what we've just read about, isn't it, where things are taken for a pledge. You didn't keep up the payments, so now I'm going to take your ox, I'm going to take this and that. It's the same deal today, isn't it? The poor are vulnerable because they typically do not own their houses and belongings and are at the mercy of landlords and the government housing associations who can evict them, cut their benefits, raise their rent when they so please. The poor have to stay where they can, even if it's on the street or in some mouldy, ramshackle dwelling place. If the landlord, the council, or the authorities tell them to move along, they have to do so. You don't have a lot of say when you don't have a lot of money in this world. This is the devil's world system that we live in. This is the setup that we've got. The poor cannot raise money to buy good legal counsel and take people and businesses to the civil law courts as rich people can. We read, the rich, they can pay for lawyers to get them off things like speeding tickets and parking fines and all sorts of things. You can throw money at things to make things go away in court. The poor cannot do that. They cannot pay for these services. The poor cannot pay to fight the system through the law courts when they have been wronged. Oftentimes they just have to put up with it. Nobody will defend them for free. The poor cannot raise money to pay for decent health care if the government's provision is inadequate. They cannot pay to skip the queue. You cannot do that when you're poor. And they cannot go to the best doctors or clinics or pay for the best medicines like the rich can. In most of the world, if you can't pay for healthcare, it's tough, isn't it? And that's why so many people want to pour into countries like the UK to use our NHS. and consequently the standards of service are going down all the time, and it's now very hard to get a doctor's appointment even if you've been paying taxes over here your whole life. But also, talking about the poor and vulnerability, being poor can make you desperate. Desperate people don't complain about poor working conditions or illegal working conditions. They need the money, so they put up with things that rich people do not choose to put up with. Desperate people do not have the leverage in most situations, and the rich oftentimes know this. The poor oftentimes are at the mercy of their employers. In desperation, when people are seriously broke, people also turn to both dangerous and illegal occupations in order to make ends meet. Prostitution is a big one. The majority of people who get involved with that are desperate, poor women who hate what they do but have no other means of making enough money to get by. And such people who operate outside the parameters of the law are certainly vulnerable as they regularly get exploited, hence why the Lord was gentle with such types. And the poor are easily robbed, aren't they, because they cannot afford very good security. The poor oftentimes are forced to live in rough areas, if they're on the street or living in a slum, anybody can rob them and the police won't show much interest. If the poor are in properties and homes, they won't have sophisticated locks, burglar alarms and camera setups. And if the poor have got property like vehicles, they won't be parking them in nice locked garages or private driveways behind locked gates in nice low-crime neighbourhoods. The poor live at greater risks of crime and theft than the rich. And as such, then there are many more points on this, but the poor oftentimes are vulnerable. And we know, people can be poor for a multitude of different reasons. There are bad circumstances which are outside of our control, and there are poor choices which are within our control. But these things are generally true to all who find themselves without money in this world. You see, the poor are vulnerable, and oftentimes they are at they are at the mercy of the rich and powerful. And they regularly get exploited and mistreated. And God seems to permit this whole thing to happen. And this is what Job is saying. He's saying, how come the rich and powerful get to exploit all these people? It happened in them days, 2,000 years before the first advent. It happens nearly 4,000 years later. Not much has changed on that front. And in these verses, Job, he refers to a certain type of person who exploits the poor, and that would be the tyrants, the bully, those in positions of government and authority, the big man, those who abuse their power for gain or just because of some perverted or sadistic thrill. They get a kick out of dominating weaker people who cannot fight back. It's easy, isn't it, to bully those who are beneath you in life. And some people, they love to abuse people and they have the power to do it. There's a whole lot more you can say on that. They did this thing in America years ago called the Stanford Prison Experiment. They just wanted to understand, from a secular point of view, psychology. They had a bunch of university students and they set up like a mock prison, and some of them were playing the roles of prisoners and some were playing the roles of prison guards, and they had to call off the experiment. It's very infamous because the guards became drunk on their power and started to abuse the prisoners. And even though the whole thing was fictional, it revealed a very twisted thing inside of humanity, the depths of depravity, where people, when they get a bit of power, it goes to their heads and suddenly they become on an ego trip. And it's just something that's messed up within fallen man. Tyrants, they often act as robbers, taking and stealing the possessions of others. And the poor, they are powerless to defend themselves against corrupt authorities and robbers for the most part. So Job's first thing is, again, if God really does punish the wicked in the earth, how come these rich and powerful people get to abuse all these people under them and get away with it? And it continues. The next part in Job's set of statements in chapter 24, it's covered from verses 13 to verses 17. And in this next set of verses, Job draws attention to those who commit wicked acts in secret and get away with it. So you've got people who exploit the poor, who are like bullies. They go through life bullying their way through. And you've got those who commit secret sins and don't get caught and seem to die without getting caught or in trouble. People like Jimmy Savile, he went his whole life been like some kind of horrendous child molester, and he died, and nobody came out with stuff until after his death. So how come God didn't put a stop to him in life? You know, these set of verses, they deal with those who go unpunished because they go undiscovered. And again, we've heard just now, God does not stop these people as soon as they begin to sin. They seem to be able to carry on. God allows people, or he permits it, should I say. He does not will it, but he lets people make choices in their free will, and they commit the acts that they go on to do. Verse 13, they are of those that rebel against the light. They rebel against God. They know not the ways thereof, nor abide in the paths thereof. And we've got a few verses now. The murderer rising with the light killeth the poor and needy, and in the night, get that, is as a thief. The eye of the adulterer waiteth for the twilight, saying, no eye shall see me, and disguiseth his face. In the dark they dig through houses, which they had marked for themselves in the daytime. They know not the light, for the morning is to them even as the shadow of death. If one know them, they are in the terrors of the shadow of death. So in these verses, Job is talking about three types of secretive sinner who sin, they don't get caught, and they seem to go unpunished. As I've already spoken about today, we live in a very unjust world. You better not believe that the majority of crime actually gets prosecuted and punished. Majority of people seem to get away with stuff, don't they? And the three types of secretive sinner that Job deals with are the first type, murderers, verse 14. You've got different types of murderers, haven't you? You've got the cunning serial killers who plan and plot what they're going to do, and they go on for many years undetected. And you've got the very, the opposite end of the spectrum, the low impulse control, low IQ, violent thugs who just kill because they're angry. Secondly, you've got adulterers in verse 15. That covers all, the sex perverts, those who are cheating on their husbands and wives, the fornicators. They go out and do what they do at night time, as we've read in the verse. And thirdly, you've got burglars, those that rob homes, businesses and vehicles. They plan things in the daytime, they drive around, and they carry out their deeds at night when most people are asleep. And the thing that unites all of these three types of criminal, these three types of sinner, is that most of these crimes are done in the night, in the dark, where there is less of a chance of getting caught under the cover of darkness. And you think about the towns and cities that you've been to and that you know, the dodgy and seedy places, the nightclubs and the rough parts of town, they do not thrive in the daytime, they come alive at night time. And conversely, on the opposite end of the spectrum, Christians meet typically on Sunday mornings in the light. Again, we touch upon a very spiritual thing, that the lost love darkness and we should love the light. And in verse 17, Job tells us that the light of day is a terror to the wicked. And we know that daylight it is not a terror to honest people, but it is to the wicked because they know they'll get caught if they're seen doing what they're doing. Evil things are often done under the cover of darkness. Even in this war that's kicked off recently, it's interesting that most of the bombs and missiles and drones are going overhead at night time and not in the day. But Job's point is that the wicked are allowed to carry on in this life and go unpunished because most of the time they go undiscovered. Men may not catch them, but on the other hand we know that God knows what they are getting up to. And the third and last part of this set of verses in Job 24 are covered from verses 18 to 20 and also verses 23 to 25. And in the third part of Job chapter 24, Job talks about judgments that are not clear yet, but God is dealing with the sinners nonetheless. And we also have the subject of future judgments, God in not letting the wicked get away with everything, either in this world or in eternity. And in these verses, in these last set of verses in Job chapter 24, it's almost as if Job backtracks for a time on his previous statements about people getting away with sin and prospering in the earth. And yet Job, he reminds himself that God is still on his throne and that ultimately justice will prevail, even if the dispensing of that justice is slow. And it's been said before, hasn't it, that the wheels of God's justice, they grind slowly, but they do grind surely. Nobody's getting away with anything long term. And Job here, he repeats the view of his three friends, But he does change again and defend his original point in the last 3 verses of Job chapter 24. And we begin from verse 18, talking about how the Lord deals with these people. He is swift as the waters, their portion is cursed in the earth. He beholdeth not the way of the vineyards. So God is here spoken of as cursing the gain of the wicked. It's not blessed. To get a fortune through crime and corruption and deceit, it is not the same thing as getting a fortune through years of patience, diligence, and hard work. Those two are not the same. One method of getting gain keeps a man up at night and robs him of his peace and sleep, and the other is kept and possessed with a clear conscience, with peace. Verse 19, drought and heat consume the snow waters. As soon as the heat comes, the snow waters disappear. So doth the grave those which have sinned. Job speaks here about the brevity of life. We know from our New Testaments that the wages of sin is death. And just as snow waters quickly disappear, so too do the lives of men disappear. Life is very short and God is not mocked. Verse 20, the womb shall forget him, the worm shall feed sweetly on him, he shall be no more remembered, like forgotten about, and wickedness shall be broken as a tree. They'll be cut off, it stops. You see, we do not get long in life to commit wickedness. And even if a sinner is exalted in the world for a time, like King Herod or the various popes and queens and kings and emperors of history, they die like the rest of all the other men and get forgotten about. And the same is true today of all these wicked celebrities and famous people who openly mock God and promote Satanism and do all this terrible stuff. They too are not permitted to carry on forever. And they too one day will be forgotten about in a not too distant future. And Job goes on to give some more example of what the wicked get up to in this life as we carry on in the verses. Verse 21, he evil entreateth the barren that beareth not, and doeth not good to the widow. Talking about some of the things the wicked do. So they exploit and mistreat those who are already suffering. That's the point of that verse. You see, firstly, you have the barren, the childless woman who is alone and sad because of her situation with not being able to bear children. And in the days of Job, and for most of history, there were no care homes or nursing homes. That didn't exist. If you grew old without children or any extended family, you were going to be in for a rough time. Most people, for the majority of the history of mankind, worked in farming for the longest part. And without children, who would tend to the land and the animals in old age? That's how it was in those days. And next you have the widow, the woman whose husband has died. Her protector and provider is gone. And yet there are sickos in this world, back in Job's day and today, who will exploit and mistreat those who are weak and vulnerable, who are already suffering and heartbroken and full of sorrow. There are sick people who exploit that. People are just messed up beyond words. And yes, God permits it to happen. God does not put a stop to every instance of that. We don't live in happy clappy Disneyland where the world is full of happiness, sunshine and laughter. We believe the King James Bible, every single word of it, every jot and tittle, and we know from the pages of Scripture the Lord was not messing around when he gave us the New Testament. We live in a horrible, awful world system that's fallen, that's outside of God's original purpose and design, that's racing towards God's judgment, and that is being run and orchestrated ultimately by the devil, as he is at work today as the God of this world, unfolding his mystery of iniquity. It is not a good place to be. Verse 22, he draweth also the mighty with his power, he riseth up, and no man is sure of his life. So Job switches track, going from the wicked to what God does. And ultimately, it's up to God as to when he decides as to when a man is to leave the world. God chooses after long forbearing and trials when a man is to be cut down. But when God settles on that time, nobody can do anything about it. And as we've read, no man is sure of life. No man is sure of life. We understand even in our own experiences, death can come at any time, young, middle-aged or old. It can come in many ways, through injury or diseases, deliberately or seemingly inexplicably, accidentally as it would seem. But God oversees it all, ultimately. Verse 23, though it be given him to be in safety, whereon he resteth, yet his eyes are upon their ways. So even though the wicked can enjoy a measure of safety, seemingly, in this life, God is watching over them, And the books, as we know from the places like the book of Revelation chapter 20, the books are being filled with their deeds. Nothing is being overlooked. Verse 24, talking about the wicked again, they are exalted for a little while, but are gone and brought low. They're abased in the end. They are taken out of the way as all other, and cut off as the tops of the ears of corn. It's just like that. So Job talks here about the brief exaltation of the wicked, the rich and famous people of the world who have gone through life in total disobedience to the Bible. They're allowed to prosper for a time, but that's all it is. It is a time, it is a temporary period of time, and it is a brief period of time. And then they are gone. They are brought low, they are abased, and just as quickly as cutting the tops of the ears of corn, that is ultimately the span of their lives when compared to eternity. It's very quick, it's done very quickly. Verse 25, and with this Job finishes, "And if it be not so now, who will make me a liar and make my speech nothing worth?" It's like a final challenge to his three friends. So Job is asking his friends to prove him false. Prove me a liar. Job asks his friends to prove that his speech is meaningless and false. And so to conclude, Job draws attention to the fact that all too often in life, the opposite of what his three friends have been speaking about is true. The wicked are not always punished in the earth. We do not live in a perfectly just and fair and equitable earth, as the socialists and the do-gooders in government seem to teach. Oftentimes the wicked do prosper. Unrepentant sinners can prosper and end their days seemingly peacefully and even uneventfully. And God can allow the wicked to enjoy safety, security, good days, a time of exaltation, fame, fortune, and a reputation, an uneventful end. They are allowed to die as all other, as we've read in verse 24. And by wicked, we've read about all different types of wicked people: the tyrants, abusers of power, murderers, adulterers, thieves, people who commit things in secret. There are all kinds of wicked people in this world who seem to do okay in this life. So Job refutes his three friends' point that because Job is suffering greatly in this life, Job must be being punished by God for his wickedness. Job proves the opposite of this is true. And we know today from this chapter that no, you certainly do not want to live a wicked life, fighting and rebelling against God. That's a twisted interpretation of Scripture. God sees everything and records everything. And we know that death is a punishment in and of itself, and death, its form and its timing, is something that God ultimately permits and oversees. You know, we all have an allotted portion of time in this life. That's all we get. Our bodies are still under the sin curse, and we have earned our wages in our fallen, sinful bodies. The wages of sin is death, Romans 6:23. And we know that honour gotten by sin shall soon become shame, if not here, then out in eternity. You know, we've even seen that recently, haven't we, with all this Epstein stuff, these celebrities everyone thought were squeaky clean, people like Bill Gates, Prince Andrew and all that. You know, they've done all this stuff, and whatever honour they had in this world, it's quickly being brought to nothing, isn't it? And we know that the end of all sinners, without God's forgiveness, is dashed hopes and broken pride, abasement, being brought low, and an eternity in hell without the Lord. You know, the outlaw cannot live his whole life on the run. It's impossible. The beauty of youth is soon lost. The strong brawler will soon become a weak and feeble old man. In the end, in one way or another, the sinner's misery will come. You cannot outrun God. And Job speaks words here in chapter 24 of truth and soberness. And the conclusion of the chapter is twofold. Firstly, you cannot say that all people who are suffering are evil and are being punished or chastened by God. The poor, the persecuted for righteousness' sake, the small church, the small ministry, those who are in ill health, those who live in poor countries, you cannot say that these people are not right with God. And secondly, you cannot say that all people who are prospering, who are doing well, are being blessed by God. You can't say that either. The rich, the famous, the talented, the big churches, the big ministries, those that live in rich and powerful countries. The point is, you cannot judge people in truth fully on this side of eternity. And that is the point Job is trying to get across to his friends who have been very harsh in their judgment of him. In truth, God knows what he is doing, and nobody else knows that. we know that God does not settle accounts with men in this life. And two facts are true for all men, rich or poor. You will die, that's the first thing, rapture notwithstanding. And secondly, you will be judged after death at the judgment seat of Christ or at the great white throne judgment. Hebrews 9:27, and it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment. You see, the true judgment, where all the facts are presented, takes place in eternity, not on the earth. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 5, therefore judge nothing before the time, until the Lord come, who both will bring to light the hidden things of darkness, and will make manifest the counsels of the hearts, and then shall every man have praise of God. So for us today, the lesson is this: think twice before you open your mouth and claim to know what God is doing in somebody's life. Most of the time, just like Job's three friends, you cannot know it. And with that, we'll finish with a word of prayer and pick up from Job chapter 25 next time.